The Nevada desert stretched endlessly beneath a blood-red sunset, its vastness broken only by the modest ranch house that Clara Whitmore had called home for the past 7 years. The wooden structure sat like a lone sentinel against the amber hills, its weathered boards telling stories of harsh winters and scorching summers. Clara stood on her front porch, her fingers tracing the delicate silk of her dress, the same emerald green gown she wore every evening, a ritual as constant as the desert winds. At 34, Clara possessed the kind of beauty that desert living had refined rather than diminished. Her auburn hair caught the dying light, and her green eyes held depths that spoke of both loss and unshakable resolve. The silk dress, an anomaly in this harsh landscape, clung to her slender frame like a second skin, its fabric whispering secrets with every movement. Another peaceful evening, she murmured to herself, though her practiced eye swept the horizon with the vigilance of someone who had learned that peace was often the prelude to storm. The thunder of approaching hooves shattered the evening's tranquility. Clara's hand instinctively moved to the small of her back, where a derringer rested beneath the silk folds. 6 riders emerged from the desert haze, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, their intentions written in the aggressive way they spurred their mounts. The leader, a man whose scarred face spoke of violent encounters, dismounted with theatrical flourish. His name was Jake Morrison, though Clara knew him by reputation alone, a hired gun with a taste for other men's property and other men's wives. His cold gray eyes fixed on her with predatory interest. "Evening, Mrs. Whitmore," Morrison drawled, his voice carrying the mock courtesy that dangerous men used before revealing their true nature. "Beautiful night for a ride, wouldn't you say?" Clara remained motionless on her porch, her posture erect, her hands folded calmly before her. "Mr. Morrison, I wasn't expecting visitors." "Life's full of surprises, ma'am." He gestured to his companions, who began spreading out in a semicircle around the house. "We've come to make you an offer." "I'm not interested in selling." Morrison's laugh was like gravel scraping against stone. "Who said anything about selling sea? There's been some misunderstandings about property lines in these parts. My employer, Mr. Cornelius Blackwood, has reason to believe this land rightfully belongs to him." The name Blackwood sent a chill through Clara's heart, though her expression remained unchanged. Cornelius Blackwood, the mining magnate who had been systematically acquiring land throughout the Nevada territory, often through methods that skirted the edges of legality. She had heard whispers in town about families who had refused his offers, only to find their crops mysteriously poisoned or their livestock scattered. "My husband purchased this land legally," Clara said, her voice steady as granite. "The deed is properly recorded." "Deeds can be disputed," Morrison replied, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Especially when the original owner ain't around to defend his claim." The reference to her deceased husband, Thomas, struck like a physical blow. But Clara absorbed it without flinching. Thomas had been dead 3 years now, killed in what the sheriff had called a hunting accident, but which Clara knew was murder. The same forces that now threatened her ranch had eliminated the one man who might have stood between them and their ambitions. "You have until sunrise to reconsider," Morrison continued. "Mr. Blackwood is a generous man, but his patience has limits." Clara's fingers tightened imperceptibly around the derringer's grip. "And if I refuse, Morrison's smile was winter cold. Well, ma'am, accidents happen, especially to folks living alone in these remote parts. Kitchen fires, for instance. Terrible, dangerous things. Kitchen fires. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Clara understood perfectly. Surrender her land, or watch everything she had built with Thomas burn to ash. But beneath her calm exterior, something far more dangerous than fear was stirring. These men saw a vulnerable widow, alone and defenseless. They had no idea what secrets lay hidden beneath her silk dress, what legacy Thomas had left her, or what resources she could call upon. "I'll need time to consider your proposal," she said finally. Morrison tipped his hat in mock gallantry. "Of course, ma'am. We'll be back at dawn for your answer." As the 6 riders disappeared into the gathering darkness, Clara remained on her porch, her silhouette framed against the lamplight spilling from her windows. To any observer, she appeared to be a woman contemplating defeat. In reality, she was calculating angles, assessing resources, and preparing for war. The silk dress rustled as she turned to enter her home, the sound like whispered promises of retribution. Tonight, Clara Whitmore would not sleep. Tonight, she would remember everything Thomas had taught her about survival, about fighting, and about the hidden strengths that could turn the hunted into the hunter. Comment below if you're from the Nevada territory, or anywhere else where folks understand that sometimes a woman has to stand her ground. And if you're enjoying this tale of desert justice, hit that subscribe button because Clara's story is just getting started. The interior of Clara's ranch house revealed the same careful attention to detail that characterized everything about her life. The furnishings were simple but well-maintained, each piece serving both function and beauty. What a casual visitor might not notice were the subtle modifications Thomas had made during their marriage. The reinforced door frames, the specially constructed floor panels, and the hidden compartments that held more than household supplies. Clara moved through her home with practiced efficiency, her silk dress whispering against furniture as she prepared for the ordeal ahead. First, she retrieved a leather satchel from behind a false panel in the kitchen wall. The bag contained gold coins, enough to start a new life elsewhere if necessary. But Clara had no intention of running. This land was her home, her sanctuary, and her connection to Thomas's memory. Next, she accessed a more substantial hiding place beneath the floorboards of her bedroom. The wooden planks lifted easily, revealing a cache that would have surprised Morrison and his men considerably. 3 rifles, including a Henry repeater that Thomas had modified for accuracy and rapid fire. Boxes of ammunition, maps of the surrounding territory, marked with escape routes and defensive positions. And most importantly, a collection of documents that represented the true secret behind Clara's seemingly vulnerable existence. She spread the papers across her kitchen table, the lamplight revealing their contents. Legal documents establishing not just her ownership of the ranch, but her partnership in the Silver Creek Mining Consortium. Correspondence with territorial officials regarding Blackwood's illegal activities. Financial records showing that the poor widow possessed resources that would make Morrison's employer take notice. But the most significant document was a letter written in Thomas's careful handwriting, dated just days before his death. In it, he detailed his suspicions about Blackwood's activities and his own investigation into the mining magnate's methods. Thomas had been more than a simple rancher. He had been a former Pinkerton detective who had come west to escape his past. only to find that his skills were needed more than ever in this lawless territory. Truth finds its level, like water, seeking low ground, Clara whispered, reading Thomas's words aloud. It had been his favorite saying, his way of expressing faith that justice would eventually prevail. Now, it would be her guiding principle. The silk dress had been Thomas's wedding gift to her, purchased in San Francisco during their honeymoon. But it was more than a garment. It was a symbol of the life they had planned together, the respectability they had hoped to achieve in this wild country. When Thomas died, well-meaning friends had suggested she put away such finery, adopt the somber dress of widowhood. Instead, Clara had worn the green silk every evening, a daily reminder of what she had lost and what she still had to fight for. As midnight approached, Clara transformed her home into a fortress. She moved furniture to create defensive positions, loaded weapons, and prepared the special surprises Thomas had installed for exactly this situation. The house might appear vulnerable from the outside, but it was actually a carefully designed stronghold. Her preparations complete, Clara allowed herself a moment to remember. She touched the daguerreotype of Thomas that sat on the mantelpiece, his serious face looking out from beneath a Union Army cap. He had served with distinction during the war, earning commendations for bravery under fire. Those same qualities had made him an excellent detective and a formidable opponent for anyone who threatened what he loved. "I won't let them win, Thomas," she whispered. "I promise you that." The sound of approaching riders interrupted her reverie. Through the window, she could see torches moving in the darkness, more men than before, at least a dozen. Morrison had returned with reinforcements, confident that overwhelming force would compensate for any resistance she might offer. Clara extinguished her lamps and took position behind the reinforced oak table Thomas had built for exactly this purpose. The silk dress seemed to glow in the moonlight streaming through the windows, making her appear ethereal, almost ghostly. Perhaps that was appropriate. Tonight, the spirit of Thomas Whitmore would fight alongside her. The riders surrounded the house, their torches creating a circle of flickering light. Morrison's voice called out through the darkness, no longer bothering with false courtesy. "Time's up. Mrs. Whitmore. Come out now, and we'll make this quick and painless. Resist, and you'll watch everything burn before we're through with you." Clara's response was to cock the hammer of her rifle, the sound carrying clearly through the still air. She had made her choice, and there would be no surrender. If you're still with us, drop a comment about the strongest woman you know. Could be your grandmother, your mother, or someone else who never backed down from a fight. And don't forget to hit subscribe because Clara's about to show these outlaws what happens when they underestimate a woman who's got nothing left to lose. The first torch sailed through the air like a falling star, landing against the side of Clara's house with a shower of sparks. The dry wood caught quickly, flames beginning their hungry climb toward the roof. Morrison's men had positioned themselves in a rough circle, confident that the isolated woman would have no choice but to flee directly into their guns. They had miscalculated badly. Clara's first shot came from an unexpected angle, not from the front windows where they had expected resistance, but from a carefully concealed port in the house's eastern wall. The bullet took one of Morrison's men clean from his saddle, the crack of the Henry rifle echoing across the desert like thunder. "She's shooting from the side." Someone shouted, but Clara was already moving, using the network of concealed firing positions Thomas had built into the house's structure. Her silk dress flowed behind her like liquid emerald as she repositioned, each movement calculated and precise. The second shot came from the opposite side of the house, dropping another rider. Now Morrison's men were confused, unsure where the next attack would come from. In their minds, they were facing a lone woman with perhaps a single rifle. The reality was far more dangerous. "Burn her out," Morrison bellowed, his calm facade cracking. "Throw every torch you've got." More flames erupted against the house's walls, but Clara had prepared for this too. Thomas had installed a primitive but effective sprinkler system, fed by the house's water supply. As the fires spread, she activated the mechanism, buying herself precious time. Through the smoke and confusion, Clara moved like a ghost in green silk. Her third shot shattered Morrison's torch, leaving him momentarily blinded. Her fourth sent his horse rearing, forcing him to fight for control. She was systematically dismantling their confidence, turning their overwhelming advantage into chaos. But the house was truly burning now, the flames spreading despite her efforts. Smoke began filling the interior, forcing her to make a choice: remain and be consumed, or venture outside, where Morrison's remaining men waited. Clara chose a third option. The trapdoor in her bedroom floor led not just to a storage space, but to a tunnel Thomas had excavated during their first year on the ranch. It emerged in the stable, 30 yards from the main house, and concealed from view by a carefully positioned haystack. As the outlaws continued their assault on the burning building, Clara made her escape through the underground passage. The tunnel was narrow and dusty, barely wide enough for her shoulders. The silk dress caught on rough timber supports, but she pressed forward, emerging into the stable where her mare waited. Clover was a magnificent animal, black as midnight with white markings, trained for both speed and stealth. Clara had saddled her earlier as part of her preparations. From the stable, Clara could see the full scope of Morrison's assault. The house was engulfed in flames, and his men were closing in, expecting to find her corpse in the wreckage. Instead, they would find something far more dangerous: a woman who had turned their own tactics against them. The Henry rifle sang again, this time from an entirely unexpected direction. Clara's shot from the stable caught Morrison's lieutenant as he dismounted, sending him spinning to the ground. Now the outlaws realized their terrible mistake. Their quarry had escaped their trap and was hunting them from the darkness. "She's in the stable," Morrison roared, wheeling his horse toward the building, but Clara was already moving, leading Clover out the back entrance and into the maze of arroyos and rock formations that surrounded her property. What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse played out across the moonlit desert. Clara knew every stone, every hiding place, every trick of light and shadow in this country. Morrison's men, strangers to the terrain, found themselves at a devastating disadvantage. She led them through a series of narrow canyons where their superior numbers meant nothing, picking them off one by one with the precision Thomas had taught her. The silk dress, impractical as it seemed, actually helped her. Its flowing fabric broke up her silhouette in the moonlight, making her a harder target to track. By dawn, only Morrison and 2 of his men remained. They huddled together in the shelter of a massive boulder, their confidence shattered, their mission a complete failure. The woman they had expected to terrorize had become their nightmare. A green specter who struck from the shadows and vanished like smoke. Clara watched them from a ridge above, her rifle ready. She could end it now, Finish Morrison and his surviving men. But Thomas's voice echoed in her memory. Truth finds its level, like water seeking low ground. There was a better way. A way that would serve justice more completely than simple revenge. Morning sun painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson as Clara made her decision. Morrison and his men would live, but they would carry a message back to Cornelius Blackwood. The war for her ranch was far from over, but the first battle had been decisively won. The silk dress fluttered in the desert breeze as Clara turned her horse toward town. It was time to reveal the full extent of her resources. Time to show Blackwood and his allies that they had awakened something far more dangerous than a grieving widow. Are you still watching from your corner of the world? Let us know in the comments where you're from and whether you think Clara should have finished Morrison when she had the chance. And if you're invested in this tale of desert justice, smash that subscribe button because Clara's war is just beginning. The town of Silver Creek dozed in the morning sun, its single main street lined with the usual collection of saloons, general stores, and modest businesses that characterized every frontier settlement. But beneath its sleepy exterior, Silver Creek harbored secrets and ambitions that reached all the way to the territorial capital. Clara Whitmore rode into town wearing her green silk dress, now dusty from her night of warfare, but still elegant, still defiant. News of the previous night's events had already reached the settlement. Morrison's surviving men had limped into town just before dawn, their tales of the vengeful widow spreading like wildfire through the saloons and boarding houses. By the time Clara tied her horse to the hitching post outside the Silver Creek Bank, half the town was watching from windows and doorways. The bank president, Ezra Hutchinson, greeted Clara with the nervous deference of a man who had just realized he might have badly misjudged someone's importance. Hutchinson was thin and scholarly, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the pale complexion of someone who spent his days indoors counting other people's money. What he lacked in physical presence, however, he made up for in financial acumen and careful attention to detail. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, rising from behind his mahogany desk as she entered his private office. "I trust you're well, after last night's difficulties." "Quite well, Mr. Hutchinson. Thank you for your concern." Clara settled into the leather chair across from his desk, arranging her silk skirts with practiced grace. "I believe it's time to discuss certain business matters that have been waiting for the proper moment." Hutchinson's hands trembled slightly as he opened his ledger. He had known Clara as the quiet widow who made modest deposits from her small cattle operation. He had not known about the other accounts, the ones established under different names, but linked through careful legal documents to the woman sitting across from him. "The Silver Creek Mining Consortium," Clara said simply. "I believe you have some papers for me to sign." The consortium had been Thomas's masterpiece, a carefully constructed web of investments and partnerships that had taken him 3 years to establish. On the surface, it appeared to be a collection of small-time prospectors and investors. In reality, it controlled mineral rights to over 10,000 acres of Nevada territory, including several sites that Blackwood desperately wanted for his own operations. As Hutchinson spread the documents across his desk, the true scope of Clara's resources became apparent. She was not just a rancher's widow. She was a substantial landowner, a mining investor, and a legal obstacle that Blackwood could not simply burn away or intimidate into submission. The consortium has been waiting for your decision regarding the Blackwood offers, Hutchinson said, his voice barely above a whisper. The other partners have been concerned about potential retaliation. Clara's green eyes hardened. Mr. Blackwood made his intentions clear last night. The time for negotiation is over. She signed the papers with bold, decisive strokes, activating legal mechanisms that Thomas had put in place years before. The consortium would not sell to Blackwood under any circumstances. More importantly, they would begin their own expansion, acquiring properties that Blackwood had assumed would be his. But Clara's most significant move came when she opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a collection of documents that made Hutchinson's face go pale. These were not business papers. They were criminal evidence. Detailed records of Blackwood's illegal activities, documented proof of bribery, fraud, and violence. Thomas had been collecting this evidence for months before his death, building a case that could destroy Blackwood's empire. I'll need these documents copied and sent to the territorial governor, Clara said, and to the federal marshal in Carson City, and to the editors of newspapers in San Francisco and Denver. Hutchinson nodded eagerly, understanding now why Clara had survived Morrison's attack. She was not just defending her ranch. She was waging a carefully planned campaign that would use the law as effectively as any rifle. As Clara prepared to leave the bank, Hutchinson cleared his throat nervously. Mrs. Whitmore, might I ask? The dress you wear. It's quite distinctive. Is there a particular reason you've chosen to maintain such elegance in these circumstances? Clara paused at the door, her hand resting on the polished brass handle. This dress, Mr. Hutchinson, was my wedding gift from my husband. Every morning when I put it on, I remember the promises we made to each other. Every evening when I take it off, I remember the promise I made to him after he died. And what promise was that? That his killers would face justice, no matter how long it took or how powerful they believed themselves to be. The silk whispered against the doorframe as Clara left the bank, leaving Hutchinson alone with the documents that would reshape the power structure of Silver Creek. Outside, the townspeople watched her with new respect, recognizing that the quiet widow had just declared war on the most powerful man in the territory. Clara's next stop was the telegraph office, where she sent messages to allies in Carson City and San Francisco. The war for her ranch had become something larger, a battle for the soul of the territory itself. Blackwood represented the old way of doing business, where power came from violence and intimidation. Clara represented something new, the possibility that law and justice could prevail over corruption and greed. The operator, a young man named Billy Chambers, handed her the receipts for her telegrams with something approaching reverence. Mrs. Whitmore, ma'am, if you don't mind me saying so, what you did last night. It gives folks hope that maybe things can change around here. Clara smiled, the first genuine smile she had shown since Morrison's visit. Change is coming, Billy, but it will take all of us working together to make it happen. As she walked back to her horse, Clara noticed the way people looked at her now. The silk dress no longer marked her as out of place in this rough country. Instead, it had become a symbol of refinement that refused to be intimidated, of civilization that would not bow to barbarism. Keep watching to see how this story unfolds. Drop a comment below if you think Clara's strategy will work, or if you think Blackwood has more tricks up his sleeve. And don't forget to subscribe, because this desert tale is heading toward an epic showdown that will determine the future of the entire territory. The Blackwood Mining Company's headquarters sat on the edge of Silver Creek, like a monument to industrial ambition. The 3-story brick building, imported at enormous expense from San Francisco, dominated the modest wooden structures around it, its windows gleaming like predatory eyes in the afternoon sun. From the top-floor office, Cornelius Blackwood surveyed his domain with the satisfaction of a man who had built an empire through careful calculation and ruthless execution. At 55, Blackwood possessed the kind of lean, weathered features that spoke of years spent in harsh climates, pursuing dangerous opportunities. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his clothing immaculate, despite the desert setting. But it was his eyes that revealed his true nature, pale blue and utterly cold. They held no warmth, no mercy, no recognition of limits to his ambition. The news of Morrison's failure had reached him an hour earlier, delivered by the shaken survivors of the night's assault. Now he stood at his window, studying the distant smoke that still rose from Clara Whitmore's burned ranch, trying to understand how a lone woman had turned his carefully planned operation into a catastrophe. Morrison was a fool, he said to the man seated across from his desk. I should have known better than to trust such crude work to crude men. His companion was a stark contrast to Morrison's obvious brutality. Dr. Edmund Carver had been educated at Harvard, trained in law and medicine, and possessed one of the finest minds in the territory. He was also completely immoral, his considerable intellect devoted entirely to advancing Blackwood's interests regardless of the human cost. Mrs. Whitmore has proven more resourceful than anticipated, Carver said, his cultured voice carrying just a hint of admiration. Perhaps it's time to reconsider our approach. Blackwood turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. Tell me about her background, everything you've discovered. Carver consulted a leather-bound notebook, the pages filled with his precise handwriting. Clara Whitmore, née Brennan, born in Boston 34 years ago, educated at Miss Porter's school, unusual for someone who ended up on a Nevada ranch. Married Thomas Whitmore 7 years ago in San Francisco. No children. Her husband was the interesting one, former Union Army officer. Later, a Pinkerton detective. Pinkerton. Blackwood's voice carried a note of understanding. That explains her tactics last night. He would have trained her, prepared her. Indeed, Thomas Whitmore was investigating irregularities in territorial land claims when he died. His death was classified as a hunting accident, but we both know better. Blackwood moved to a wall safe, withdrawing several documents. The question is, what did he tell her before he died? What did he leave her? The answer came sooner than expected. A knock at the office door announced the arrival of Billy Chambers from the telegraph office, hat in hand, and clearly nervous about entering the inner sanctum of the territory's most powerful man. Mr. Blackwood. Sir. Billy stammered. I thought you should know about the telegrams Mrs. Whitmore sent this morning. Blackwood's expression didn't change, but Carver leaned forward with interest. The young man had been on their payroll for months, feeding them information about communications passing through Silver Creek. Continue, Blackwood said simply. She sent messages to the territorial governor, the federal marshal, and newspaper editors in San Francisco and Denver. All about, well, about you, sir, about your business activities. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any outburst of anger. Blackwood walked slowly to his desk, his mind working through the implications. Clara Whitmore was not just defending her ranch. She was mounting a coordinated attack on his entire operation. "What exactly did these messages contain?" Carver asked. Billy pulled out a folded paper, his hands shaking. I made copies, sir. She mentioned documents, evidence of illegal activities. She's asking for investigations." Blackwood read the telegram transcripts with growing concern. This was not the desperate action of a grieving widow. This was the calculated strategy of someone who understood exactly how to bring down a man like him. The reference to evidence was particularly troubling. If Thomas Whitmore had been as thorough as his wife's actions suggested, there might be enough documentation to destroy everything Blackwood had built. "We need those documents," he said finally. "Whatever she has, wherever she's hidden them, we need them destroyed." Carver nodded thoughtfully. A direct assault has already failed. Perhaps a more subtle approach is required. Subtle approaches take time, and time is something we may not have. If her telegrams reach the right people, if investigations begin. Blackwood didn't finish the sentence. Both men understood the implications. The mining magnate walked to a large map of the territory mounted on his office wall. Colored pins marked his various properties and interests. A web of influence that extended throughout Nevada and into California. At the center of it all was Silver Creek, the hub of his operations and the source of his power. "She's threatening everything," he said, more to himself than to Carver. "One woman in a silk dress, and she's threatening to bring down an empire." "Perhaps," Carver suggested, "we're approaching this incorrectly. Instead of viewing Mrs. Whitmore as an obstacle to be removed, we should consider her as a resource to be acquired." Blackwood raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "She's clearly intelligent, resourceful, and commands respect in the community. If she could be convinced to join our cause rather than oppose it. After last night, after she killed half of Morrison's men." Blackwood's laugh was bitter. "I think that bridge has been thoroughly burned." But Carver was warming to his theme. Not convinced through negotiation, perhaps, but there are other methods of persuasion. Leverage, pressure points. Everyone has something they value more than principles. Blackwood considered this. It was true that direct confrontation had failed, but perhaps there were other ways to neutralize the threat Clara represented. She might be formidable in combat, but she was still human, still vulnerable to the right kind of pressure. "What do you have in mind?" he asked. Carver's smile was cold as winter. "Leave that to me. But first, we need to discover exactly what evidence she possesses and where it's hidden. That will require a different kind of expertise than Morrison provided." As the two men began planning their next move, neither noticed the small figure crouched beneath the window outside Blackwood's office. Jenny Martinez, the Mexican girl who cleaned the building's floors, had overheard enough to understand that Mrs. Whitmore was in greater danger than she knew. Jenny's English was limited, but her loyalty to the woman who had helped her family during the previous winter's harsh months was absolute. When darkness fell, Jenny would begin her own mission, carrying word to Clara Whitmore that her enemies were already planning their next assault, and that this time they would be fighting a war of minds rather than guns. The silk dress might have survived one battle, but the war for Silver Creek was just beginning. Wondering what Blackwood's next move will be? Share your predictions in the comments below. And if you're invested in Clara's fight for justice, Make sure you're subscribed, because the final confrontation is going to be one for the ages. 3 days after the attack on her ranch, Clara Whitmore stood in the ruins of her home, her green silk dress incongruous among the charred timbers and ash-covered foundations. The morning sun cast long shadows across the destruction. But Clara was not here to mourn. She was here to retrieve something that Blackwood and his men could never have imagined existed. Thomas had been more than thorough in his preparations. The tunnel that had saved her life led not just to the stable, but to a carefully concealed chamber beneath the property's old well. This underground vault, lined with stone and sealed against moisture, contained the complete record of Thomas's investigation into Blackwood's criminal empire. Clara descended into the chamber using a rope ladder, her movements careful and deliberate. The space was small but well organized, with wooden crates containing documents, photographs, and even physical evidence of Blackwood's crimes. Thomas had been building a case that would have impressed any federal prosecutor if he had lived to present it. Among the papers, Clara found her husband's journal, its leather cover worn from constant handling. The final entries, written in the days before his death, revealed the full scope of what Thomas had discovered. Blackwood was not just a corrupt businessman. He was the leader of a criminal organization that controlled politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials throughout the territory. But the most damning evidence was a series of photographs showing Blackwood meeting with known outlaws and corrupt officials. These images, taken by Thomas using a concealed camera, provided irrefutable proof of conspiracy and corruption at the highest levels of territorial government. With this evidence, Clara could destroy Blackwood completely. She was still reading through the documents when she heard footsteps above. Jenny Martinez's voice called down softly in heavily accented English. "Senora Clara, you must come quickly. Bad men coming again." Clara quickly gathered the most important documents, sealing them in a waterproof pouch. The rest would have to remain hidden until she could return with proper help. She climbed out of the chamber to find Jenny waiting with obvious anxiety. "What men?" Clara asked. "Not like before. These men, they dress like gentlemen. But I hear them talking at Senor Blackwood's office. They plan to take you alive." Clara's blood ran cold. If Blackwood had decided to abandon direct confrontation in favor of kidnapping, it meant he was becoming desperate. Desperate men were often more dangerous than openly violent ones. "How many men?" "6, maybe 8. They wait at the bridge over Silver Creek. They think you come back to town that way." Clara smiled grimly. Blackwood's men were thinking like city dwellers, assuming she would take the obvious route. Instead, she would use the old mining trails that Thomas had shown her. Paths that wound through the mountains and emerged at the far end of town. The ride through the high country took most of the day, but it gave Clara time to think. She could not simply continue running and hiding. Eventually, Blackwood's resources would overwhelm her ability to resist. She needed to force a final confrontation on terms that favored her rather than him. As the sun began to set, Clara found herself overlooking Silver Creek from the mountainside cemetery where Thomas was buried. His grave marker stood among the weathered headstones of other pioneers who had died trying to build something lasting in this harsh country. She dismounted and knelt beside his grave, placing her hand on the simple wooden cross. "I know what you'd want me to do," she whispered. "Truth finds its level, like water seeking low ground. but sometimes the ground needs to be shaken up a little first. That evening, Clara made her way into town through back streets and alleys, avoiding the main thoroughfares where Blackwood's men might be watching. Her destination was not the bank or the telegraph office, but the modest home of Father Miguel Santos, the Catholic priest who served Silver Creek's Mexican community. Father Santos was a small, elderly man whose gentle manner concealed a core of steel forged by years of ministering to the poor and oppressed. He had known Thomas well and had been a frequent visitor to Clara's ranch in the months following her husband's death. "Clara, my child," he said, opening his door to her urgent knock. "I have been worried about you since the fire. Father, I need your help, and I need to use your church." Within an hour, word had spread throughout the Mexican quarter that Señora Clara needed assistance. These were people who understood oppression, who had suffered under Blackwood's expansion of mining operations into their traditional lands. When Clara explained what she needed, they responded with enthusiasm. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Clara would appear at the church the following morning, ostensibly to attend Mass, but actually to draw Blackwood's men into a trap. The church would be filled with witnesses, respectable citizens, whose testimony could not be easily dismissed. When Blackwood's men made their move, they would be doing so in front of dozens of people who could attest to their criminal behavior. But Clara's real masterstroke involved the documents she had retrieved from Thomas's cache. Copies had been made and distributed to trusted allies throughout the territory. If anything happened to her, the evidence would still reach the proper authorities. Blackwood's only choice would be to retreat or face complete exposure. As dawn broke over Silver Creek, Clara prepared for what might be her final appearance in the green silk dress. She stood before the small mirror in Father Santos's guest room, adjusting the emerald fabric that had become her symbol of defiance. The dress was travel-stained and worn, but it still represented everything she had fought to preserve. The church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to Sunday Mass. Clara walked through the streets of Silver Creek one last time, her head held high, her steps confident. Behind her came a growing procession of supporters, Mexican families, small ranchers, shopkeepers, and others who had suffered under Blackwood's reign. Blackwood's men were waiting, just as she had expected. Dr. Carver stood on the church steps with 6 hired guns, their intentions obvious despite their attempt to appear respectable. But they had not expected the crowd that surrounded Clara, the witnesses who filled the street and spilled onto the church grounds. "Mrs. Whitmore," Carver called out, his cultured voice carrying easily across the morning air. "Mr. Blackwood would like to speak with you. Privately." Clara stopped 20 feet from the church steps, her supporters forming a protective semicircle around her. The silk dress caught the morning light, making her appear to glow like an avenging angel. "Any business Mr. Blackwood has with me can be conducted in front of these good people," she replied, her voice clear and strong. "I have nothing to hide." Carver's smile was thin and cold. "I'm afraid that's not acceptable. Mr. Blackwood has concerns about certain accusations you've been making. He feels a private discussion would be more appropriate." "The kind of private discussion your men attempted at my ranch 3 nights ago." A murmur ran through the crowd. Many had heard rumors about the attack, but Clara's public acknowledgement confirmed what they had suspected. Father Santos stepped forward from the church doorway, his voice carrying the authority of moral leadership. "Dr. Carver," This is the Lord's house. If you have business to conduct, perhaps it would be better done elsewhere." "Stay out of this, priest," one of Carver's men snarled, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. The mistake was immediate and obvious. The crowd's murmur became an angry buzz, and several of the Mexican men stepped forward protectively. Threatening a priest in front of his congregation was not just tactically foolish, it was a declaration of war against the entire community. Clara seized the moment. "You see how these men operate," she called out, her voice carrying to every corner of the crowd. "They threaten women in their homes, burn property, and now they dare to threaten a man of God on the steps of his own church." From her dress, she withdrew a folded document, one of the copies she had made of Thomas's evidence. "I have here proof of Mr. Blackwood's crimes, proof of bribery, fraud, and murder. Proof that the territorial government has been corrupted by men who recognize no law but their own greed." Carver's composure finally cracked. "That document is stolen property," he declared. "Mrs. Whitmore is a thief and a murderer. She killed 6 men 3 nights ago in cold blood. 6 men who came to my home with torches, who threatened to burn me alive if I didn't surrender my property." Clara's eyes blazed with righteous fury. 6 men who worked for Cornelius Blackwood, following his orders to terrorize and murder innocent people. The crowd was fully with her now, their voices rising in support. But Carver still had his guns, and Clara could see him calculating whether violence might still succeed, despite the witnesses. She needed to force his hand completely. "Dr. Carver," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "If Mr. Blackwood is so confident in the righteousness of his cause, why doesn't he come here himself? Why does he send hired killers to do his work?" "Because," a new voice rang out across the churchyard, "he wanted to give you one last chance to be reasonable." Cornelius Blackwood himself emerged from behind the church, flanked by a dozen more armed men. He had been waiting in reserve, ready to appear if Carver's initial approach failed. Now he strode forward with the confidence of a man who had never met an obstacle he couldn't overcome. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his pale eyes fixed on her with predatory intensity. "You've caused me considerable inconvenience, but I'm a fair man. Surrender those documents, leave the territory, and I'll allow you to live." The silk dress rustled as Clara straightened to her full height. "The same offer you made to my husband before you had him killed." Thomas Whitmore died in a hunting accident. The sheriff's report was quite clear. Sheriff Morrison, who happens to be Jake Morrison's brother. How convenient that the investigation was conducted by a relative of one of your hired guns. The revelation sent another shock through the crowd. The corruption was even deeper than most had suspected, reaching into law enforcement itself. Blackwood's face darkened with anger, but Clara wasn't finished. "I have copies of these documents in Carson City, San Francisco, and Denver," she announced. "Federal marshals are already investigating your operations. The territorial governor has suspended several officials pending review. Your empire is crumbling. Mr. Blackwood, and no amount of violence will stop it now." For the first time in years, Cornelius Blackwood found himself facing a situation he couldn't control through intimidation or bribery. The woman in the green silk dress had outmaneuvered him completely, turning his own tactics against him and exposing his operations to federal scrutiny. But Blackwood was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. His hand moved to his gun, a nickel-plated Colt that had ended more than one business disagreement. If he couldn't have victory, he would at least have revenge. "Then you've signed your own death warrant," he snarled, drawing the weapon. The crowd screamed and scattered, but Clara stood her ground. She had known this moment would come, had prepared for it just as Thomas had taught her. Her own derringer appeared in her hand, with practiced speed, the small weapon seeming almost delicate compared to Blackwood's Colt. But sometimes, in the desert heat of a Sunday morning, with the church bell still echoing across the territory, justice comes down to the simple question of who shoots first and who shoots truest. The two shots rang out almost simultaneously, their echoes rolling across Silver Creek like thunder. When the smoke cleared, Cornelius Blackwood lay dying in the dust, his pale eyes staring sightlessly at the Nevada sky. Clara Whitmore still stood, her green silk dress unmarked, her aim as true as her husband had taught her. Dr. Carver and the remaining gunmen found themselves surrounded by an angry crowd that no longer feared them. Without Blackwood's money and influence, they were just common criminals facing the justice of an aroused community. Most surrendered immediately. The few who tried to fight were quickly overwhelmed. As the dust settled and the immediate danger passed, Clara found herself surrounded by the people of Silver Creek. These were the miners and ranchers, the shopkeepers and farmers, the Mexican families and Protestant churchgoers who had been waiting for someone to stand up to Blackwood's tyranny. "What happens now?" Father Santos asked, placing a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder. Clara looked out over the crowd, her green eyes thoughtful. "Now we build something better. We elect honest sheriffs, support honest judges, and make sure that what happened here never happens again." The silk dress caught the morning breeze as she turned toward the church. "And first, I think we should give thanks for the justice that has been done here today." As the people of Silver Creek filed into the small church, many were already talking about the changes that would come. The territorial government would have to answer for its corruption. New leaders would emerge from the community itself, and at the center of it all would be the woman in the green silk dress, who had proven that truth really does find its level, like water seeking low ground. But Clara's thoughts were on Thomas as she took her place in the front pew. She had kept her promise to him, had seen justice done for his murder and the crimes that had plagued their adopted home. The silk dress, once a symbol of the life they had planned together, had become something new, a banner of hope for all those who refused to be intimidated by corruption and violence. The church bells continued to ring across Silver Creek, calling the territory to a new dawn of justice and community. And in the front pew, a widow in green silk bowed her head in prayer, knowing that her husband's spirit could finally rest in peace. If you've made it this far in Clara's incredible journey, drop a comment and let us know what you thought of her fight for justice. Did she make the right choices? Could you have stood up to Blackwood's empire the way she did? And don't forget to subscribe, because stories like this, tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, are what this channel is all about. Truth really does find its level. And sometimes it takes someone in a silk dress to remind us all of that fundamental fact. The desert wind carried the sound of those church bells across the territory, and with them, the promise that justice, though sometimes delayed, would always eventually find its way home.